Good evening, and welcome to the premiere edition of Inside Washington on SBS. I'm your host, Richard Allen. Permit me to introduce my longtime friend and co-host, Ms. Young-shim, a member of the Republic of Korea's National Assembly and a longtime specialist in Korean-American relations. Ms. Do is also the president of the newly formed Korean Institute for American Affairs. Ms. Do, it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to work with you on the exciting new edition of Inside Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. It certainly is an exciting event this evening, and I'm very pleased to co-host Inside Washington with you. As many of our viewers know, Mr. Richard Allen is a very familiar face to many Koreans. He is one of the U.S. leading experts in foreign affairs and national security issues. He served as National Security Advisor to President Reagan and his longtime campaign advisor. He also worked for President Richard Nixon as Foreign Policy Advisor. He is currently the chairman of Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation and also Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution in Stanford. Also, he is a chairman of AEA, an international business consulting firm, offices both in Washington, D.C. and in Seoul.
Tonight, SBS is delighted to have on the premiere edition of Inside Washington a very special guest. His career spans 50 years, beginning with his service in the military, as an elected member of the House of Representatives, a United States Senator, 8 years as Vice President in the administration of President Eisenhower, and finally as twice elected 37th President of the United States. Richard Nixon has left a truly lasting imprint upon the shape of public policy in the United States and especially upon foreign and national security affairs. Although it's been 18 years since President Nixon has been in office, he continues to exert a very important influence on the shape of the public policy debate in the United States. He has just completed his 9th book of his career. This book, called Seize the Moment, America's Role in a One Superpower World, is a book filled with prescriptions and analysis of trenchant debate, and it itself has had a profound impact on the newly developing debate about the role of the United States in the post-Cold War world. Mr. President, thank you very much for being with us, and millions of SBS viewers, along with Ms. Do and myself, welcome you and thank you for taking time to be with us this evening.
Well, I'm delighted to be on this program because I have such pleasant memories of my first visit to Korea, which was in 1953 when Ms. Do was just 5 years of age. And I remember on that occasion how impressed Mrs. Nixon and I were by the fact that it was a very, very cold day. We were wearing overcoats, and there were thousands and thousands of Korean children in just little cotton suits that were out there waving American Korean flags. And at that time I said to her that there's no question these people are going to make it. They're so strong.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, all your life you have been an advocate of taking the long view, what you call the long view, and that means a long-term strategic view. In your book, Seize the Moment, you describe a very poignant moment when some 32 years ago, in a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev, you each made predictions about your grandchildren, each other's grandchildren to be precise. Could you tell us about that moment, and what about the predictions? How did they come out?
Well, the disagreement that we had has been well publicized. It was called the kitchen debate because it occurred at an exhibition that the United States had there in a model kitchen. We were talking about what was going on there, but also what was going on in the world. And it went on, and the differences that we had have been very widely publicized. But as we neared the end of the conclusion, near the end of the discussion, Khrushchev, who was a very volatile man, stuck his finger into my chest and he said, "Your grandchildren will live under communism." Well, I responded, "Your grandchildren will live in freedom." At the time, I was sure he was wrong, but I must admit I wasn't sure I was right. But now events have proved that I was right, because Khrushchev's grandchildren do live in freedom, and the great question of our time, can they continue to live in freedom, or will they revert to the old or a new despotism.
What do you think made your prediction so accurate and placed his prediction, to use Marxist terminology, on the dustbin of history?
The prediction I made proved to be accurate, not simply because the West stood firm, as it did, but because communism had a fatal flaw. It just wouldn't work. It was doomed to fail. He believed in communism, as did all of the leaders who followed him. Brezhnev, for example, believed in communism. So did Gorbachev. The reason he failed was that he couldn't give up on his belief in communism. But communism was an idea which simply would not work. It did not produce a better life for people. And the Russian people, the people of the other republics in the former Soviet Union, rebelled against it. It's interesting to note that the communists came to power in Russia through violence in 1917, but they peacefully were thrown out. And this is, of course, gives us a good idea as to what can happen in the future.
Mr. President, you have pointed out after communist victory in 1975 in Vietnam that many thought the United States was finished, that it was unwilling and unable to act decisively. Yet in 1992, U.S. emerged as the only complete superpower of the world. How do you think, Mr. President, the United States will use its unprecedented power, and how is it going to best protect the interest of the United States as well as those of its allies?
It is a role that the people of the United States don't particularly want. The United States really would prefer not to have the responsibilities abroad, but there's no one else. Looking around the world today, if the United States does not lead, who is going to lead? The Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, the Germans? Those are the only other nations that have the military and economic potential to lead. So the United States must lead. Second, as far as the American people are concerned, they do not want to impose their system on anybody else. That is why the leadership position is good, not just for the United States, it's good for the other people in the world. Whether it is Korea or Japan or the nations of Western Europe or the people in what was formerly the Third World, now we call it the Second World, our only interest is to have them have the opportunity that we have to grow up in a world in peace, to choose their own governments through a democratic system, if they prefer that, and to have freedom in its broadest aspects.
Mr. President, you say that the United States has a vital interest in preventing the acquisition of nuclear weapons, particularly among the developing countries. As we look at the Korean Peninsula today, however, there is a very dangerous situation rapidly developing, and our government in Washington has defined this as not only the most serious security threat in Asia, but perhaps the most serious security threat in the world, in referring to the potential acquisition by North Korea of nuclear weapons. Now, President Roh Tae-woo of the Republic of Korea has renounced the nuclear option for his country, and he's tried to engage Kim Il-sung in a dialogue, a peaceful dialogue, in order to persuade North Korea also to renounce the nuclear option. How could the United States best participate in this process of persuading Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans not to choose the nuclear option?
Well, first, the United States must continue its all-out support of the Republic of Korea. That at least is a deterrent to North Korea. If they do engage in aggressive action, they're going to commit suicide. We have to make it clear that an attack on the Republic of Korea by North Korea would be an attack on the United States. We must begin with that. Then the United States must work through other governments, the Chinese, for example, the Russians, to the extent they want to play a world role, to get them to lean on North Korea, to abide by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and not to go forward with its nuclear weapons program. Let me say why having nuclear weapons in North Korea cannot be tolerated. France has nuclear weapons. Britain has nuclear weapons. We're not afraid of that because we know they will never be used aggressively. But North Korea is an outlaw regime. Nobody knows what Kim Il-sung will do. Maybe the South Koreans do, but I don't know. I don't think our government knows. Under the circumstances, You cannot have in that man's hand or his successor's hands these weapons which could start not just a war in the Korean Peninsula, but in the whole world. I would say finally, the Japanese are involved here. The Japanese do not have nuclear weapons. They could get them almost within a matter of months because of their enormous industrial capability. In the case that North Korea acquires nuclear weapons, that would be a mortal threat to Japan, and Japan would have to go nuclear. So what we're talking about here is not just the Korean Peninsula. We're talking about peace and security in the balance of Asia and the balance of the world.
Mr. President, if North Korea acquires nuclear weapons, what specific steps can we and our allies can take? For example, can the United Nations step in?
Well, the United Nations could step in, but the problem there is that we say, well, why doesn't the United Nations do something? We want to remember that during the Korean War, the only reason the United States was able to get the United Nations into that action was that the Russians were absent and could not, and the Soviets, I should say, were absent and could not exercise a veto. I do not think it is enough to say the United Nations can step in and do something about it. It means that the great powers, that means the United States, China, which still has influence there, Japan to the extent it can have influence in the future, and of course the nations of Europe, we have to make it very clear that we cannot tolerate that situation. I don't have an answer to it because what we have to bear in mind here is that North Korea has its problems. I mean, they have an economy that is in disastrous shape. The per capita income in South Korea is at least 4, maybe 5 times as great as it is in the North. They need assistance from the West, from Japan, etc. And it's got to be made clear that they've got to choose. Do they want to grow? Do they want to join the great revolution for progress in the rest of the world? Or they simply want to have nuclear weapons and then thumb their noses at the rest of the world, which, as I say, leads to suicide.
Is the military option then foreclosed, or must we keep it open in that event?
Oh, the military option must be kept open. The idea that if only we are for peace, they will be for peace is nonsense in dealing with outlaw governments. We know that. I've known it all of my life, and you have too, as you have dealt with these problems. We have to have the military option. We have to maintain our strength. We, the United States, must not reduce our forces in Korea because the military option is the only kind of activity that's going to deter the North Koreans. In the meantime, we've got to proceed through diplomatic channels. Since the North Koreans say they would like to have a nuclear-free zone, we've got to put all the pressure we can on them, economically and otherwise, to get them to abstain from developing nuclear weapons.
Mr. President, the world has been virtually turned upside down in the 2.5 years since the Berlin Wall came down. A new dynamic is emerging, and also emerging is a new Russia as a great superpower. Yet this Russia is having trouble getting its feet on the ground, so to speak, and turning its directions into a capitalist economy, a free market economy. You have made recommendations not only in your book, but in your speeches and at your recent conference about what the United States should do to help Russia, and you've also pointed out what the consequences of not helping Russia will be. Would you share with us your thoughts?
Well, Russia at the present time is at a crossroads. It is often said that the Cold War is over and that the West has won it. That's only half true. Because what has happened is that the communists have been defeated, but the ideas of freedom now are on trial. If they don't work, there will be a reversion to not communism, which has failed, but what I call a new despotism, which would pose a mortal danger to the rest of the world, because it would be infected with the virus of Russian imperialism, which of course has been a characteristic of Russian foreign policy for centuries. We begin with that. Therefore, the West has, the United States has, all those who want peace and freedom in the world, a great stake in freedom succeeding in Russia. If it succeeds, it will be an example for others to follow. It will be an example for China, for example, to follow, for the other communist states, the few that remain. If it fails, it means that the hardliners in China will get a new life. They will say, it failed there, there's no reason for us to turn to democracy. That's part of what is at stake here. The other point that we have to have in mind is that it's vitally important that it succeed, because it means that Russia, which for 70 years has been exporting or trying to export the ideas of communism to the world, will now be exporting the ideas of freedom, the ideas of democracy, the goods of freedom. It means that Russia, for example, will be able to export goods. That'll be a huge export market, for example, for the United States and other countries. So I would simply sum it up to say, for our Korean audience, it means a great deal to Korea too. Because Russia, the Soviet Union, I should say, was a very strong supporter of North Vietnam. Russia will not be a supporter of North Vietnam. And that means that we have here a potential ally joining with the United States and other free countries in putting pressure on North Korea not to go forward with a nuclear option.
Gorbachev was once everybody's favorite hero. Now he's out, and Boris Yeltsin is in. And not only in Washington, but in other parts of the West, Yeltsin was described as a boor, a power-hungry, a power-crazed lunatic, a man who was not cosmopolitan enough or deep enough a thinker, not intellectual or savvy politically enough. How could we have been so easily misled about Gorbachev's real weaknesses, which you seem to perceive very early on and warned about, and Yeltsin's strength, which very few people picked up on in time?
It's the tendency among many of those in the foreign policy establishment, of which you were a member, incidentally, to emphasize style, to be impressed by style more than substance. Gorbachev had style. He was smooth. He had an elegant wife. And incidentally, he did some positive things. He did open up the Soviet Union. Gorbachev made Yeltsin possible. But looking at the two men, they both began the same. They were both born as peasants. Gorbachev became a man of the world. Yeltsin remained a man of the people. They were different in another respect. Yeltsin has repudiated both communism and socialism. Gorbachev would not do so. And many of the observers didn't see that. The reason Gorbachev failed was that he sincerely believed in the communist idea, right to the present day, if you follow his recent column in the New York Times, and that he sincerely believed that the Soviet Empire should remain intact. It was those beliefs that brought him down. Yeltsin, on the other hand, is one who believes in democracy, believes in free markets, and that's why we should put our chips on him at this time.
Mr. President, you said one of the briefers on Yeltsin in 1991 sounded just like recording of briefer who gave a briefing on Khrushchev some 30 years ago. What about the advisors to the president? Is it fairly difficult for a chief executive to sort out the accuracy of what advisors tell him?
Oh yes, it is difficult. The main thing is to get plenty of advice, but then the president has got to decide. And in this case, for example, the briefers were overly impressed by the style factor. They said because Khrushchev drank too much and he wore sloppy clothes and spoke bad Russian grammar, that he was not going to be a strong leader. He was one of the brightest leaders. In fact, he had the quickest reaction time of any leader I've ever met. And with Yeltsin, they say that, well, he's boorish. For example, one columnist made the point that at a state dinner he used to lick caviar off of his fingers and butter. And let me say, Yeltsin may not know what kind of a fork to use at a state dinner, but he has a very sharp political knife. That's what they fail to see. Yeltsin, the man, is a very strong leader. He has his weaknesses, but he has good people around him. But mainly, he believes in the right things. He believes in democracy. He believes in freedom. He believes in free markets. And therefore, he deserves our support.
Mr. President, there are lots of pressures on a president, on a chief executive, and they come from the media, from the political opposition, from the legislature, from all sorts of places. In your book, you refer to Lithuanian President Landsbergis, who quotes Ibsen in saying, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands alone." And then you go on to say, there must be absolute inflexibility on matters of principle. Does a president have to risk his political popularity even when swimming against the tide of popular opinion of the time?
No question about it. The purpose of popularity is not to hoard it, but to use it. A popular president should use his popularity to accomplish great objectives. And here's where Yeltsin comes in. Yeltsin was enormously popular after he put down the coup, standing on top of that tank, facing down card-carrying killers from the Stalinist coup attempt. But then he had to make a decision to go toward the free market. In order to do that, he had to let the prices go up. That risked his popularity. His popularity is down. But without doing that, there's no way they can move to a free market. That is using popularity rather than hoarding it. My advice to any president, any leader, when you are popular, don't just sit on it. Use it to accomplish great goals.
In other words, don't lose your nerve.
The nerve is more important than any other factor in leadership.
Many Asian leaders are very concerned that vacuum will develop if United States gives up its vital role in stability of Asia. And as the tensions in Asia reduced, what are we to assume the long-range interest of Russia, China, and Japan, which you refer them as Pacific Triangle?
The Pacific Triangle.
Yes, and will the United States gradually withdraw its role in the security from Pacific Basin?
Well, as you know, there is a great move on at the present time among what I call the new isolationists to have the United States to withdraw from Europe because there's no longer a Soviet threat, and to withdraw from Asia for the same reason. I believe that it's very important for us to maintain a presence in Europe. I think it is indispensable that we do so in Asia. If we withdraw from Asia, what do you have? You have Japan, an economic giant, but militarily no nuclear weapons. You have China with nuclear weapons. You have Russia with nuclear weapons. Now, Russia, it's true, is not the Soviet Union, but it still has nuclear weapons. What does Japan do if the United States withdraws? It has two options. One, it can make a deal with the Chinese or the Russians, or it can go nuclear. What I am simply saying is that the United States' presence in Northeast Asia is absolutely indispensable. The Japanese, it is not in our interest, it's not in their interest. Their own people don't want to go have a stronger military. We should not encourage them to have a stronger military. If we leave, they have no choice but to do so.
But then, Mr. President, my follow-up question is that U.S. has been encouraging very much the expanded Japanese military expense last decade or so. Then do you think, Mr. President, that was wrong U.S. foreign policy and rather short-sighted U.S. foreign policy, encouraging Japan to expand its military spending?
Well, there is a view that Japan should increase its military spending. I support only military spending for defensive purposes. Under no circumstances do I think Japan should develop an offensive clout, because basically we have to face it. The memories of World War II are still out there. That would terrify Koreans. It would terrify people in Taiwan. It would terrify people in Southeast Asia, the Indonesians and the rest. We cannot have that happen. It is not in our interest, it's not in the interest of the Japanese people for them to increase their military potential. That's why we have got to retain the American guarantee of Japan's security against outside aggression. And on the other hand, Japan should increase what it does in the foreign aid area. There it is already doing slightly more than the United States. It should do massively more. It should pay for the free ride it gets on the military side by increasing its foreign aid, particularly, for example, to Russia. It should bear one of the major burdens of helping the freedom survive in what is now Russia, and of course the other former Soviet states.
There are those, Mr. President, who argue that the presence of American troops in Japan itself constitutes a cork in the bottle theory. Is that something with which you could agree?
The description of cork in the bottle has been used, of course, in other respects, as you know, around the world. I would accept it, though. I would accept it in this sense, that if we move out, if the American troops move out from Japan, Japan is not going to sit there as a helpless giant. This is the second most powerful economy in the world. The Japanese people have a great and proud history. And if we move out, they are going to then have to take steps to increase their armaments enormously, and that would have tragic repercussions all over Asia and the rest of the world.
Mr. President, since the end of World War II, American troops have been in Korea, and not only that, for more than 100 years, Korea and the United States have had extremely peaceful, productive relationships. And as Korea has grown dynamically and has been able to take on more of the challenges of modern life, it also evolves into a potential long-term ally for the United States. That is certainly the disposition of Korean leaders. Would you foresee a more responsible, a more assuming role for Korea as a real partner of the United States in the region, perhaps to offset Japanese growth, or simply to maintain our presence in a very significant way?
I wouldn't put it in terms of offsetting anybody else. Let me say the Korean-American relationship is good for Korea and it's good for us. It's remarkable that Korea has done what it did. See, Japan, after World War II, had an economic miracle, but Japan had an infrastructure of people who knew how to run a modern private enterprise economy. Korea had nothing. It had to start from scratch. It had a per capita income of only $50 when I visited there in 1953. It's now $4,600. That is very exciting. Korea also has a military potential, and Korea should play a role diplomatically on the world scene. Korea is a valued ally of the United States. They need us to assure their defense against a possible attack from North Korea, but we need them as an influential partner on the world scene. It's now in the United Nations because Korea can be a better example, for example, in now what I call second world countries, of what countries that are low on the totem pole in terms of production can do if they adopt free market and democratic principles. A democratic, growing, strong Korea is in our interest, but it's in the interests of those who cherish freedom all over the world.
Mr. President, while several countries are breaking up into smaller states, such as former Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, others are uniting. And Germany has been often cited as a model for Korean reunification. But as you have stated, Mr. President, Korean case is quite different. And there was a bitter war between South and North, which in 1953 you have witnessed, and you described it in your book in details. For 47 years, that North Korea has been completely isolated from the world, while South Korea became an international player. What do you think of Korean reunification, and how do you think it can best be achieved?
Well, first, naturally I'm for it. That's like saying I'm against sin, because basically it's unnatural for Korea to be divided, just as it was unnatural for the Germans to be divided. The Germans are now together. But for the Koreans to get together will be more difficult than for the Germans to get together, because the differences between North and South are even much greater than were the differences between West Germany and East Germany. What has to happen here is that the Koreans themselves must work this out. But on the other hand, others can play a role. The Chinese, for example, one of the reasons it's very important for the United States to continue a very good, close relationship with China is that China has good relations with North Korea. China can influence North Korea, I believe. Russia maybe can. Not as much as the Soviet Union could have, possibly, but Russia at least will have the intention to do so. I think, too, that as far as the United States is concerned, we will use all of our influence in world forums, for example, including the UN, the nuclear proliferation organizations and so forth. We will use our influence to get the North Koreans to abandon their plans to go forward with a nuclear capability, and therefore to pave the way for a North-South agreement. As I know, as you know much better than I, and our audience knows much better, there have been some encouraging signs lately, but it's been only rhetoric as far as North Korea is concerned. It has been substance as far as South Korea is concerned. What has to happen now is that all of us, the Chinese, the Americans, the other interested parties in that area, the Japanese as well, might play a role, have got to bring economic and political pressure on the North to face up to the reality that this unnatural division must end, because it's good for both that it end.
Mr. President, in the years ahead, the remaining part of the 90s and perhaps even into the year 2000 and beyond, there will be increasing pressures on the United States to pay more attention to its domestic house, to get it in order. You mentioned, for example, in Seize the Moment, the problems of drug abuse, education, inadequate medical care, and all sorts of pressures that are operating to refocus our attention at home now that the Cold War has been won and supposedly we don't have to worry about that anymore. Can the United States remain a viable, reliable ally with these pressures operating at home to focus those energies and those resources inward? Will we be a good long-term partner for our allies, and can we play the role that you've described?
It's difficult at this time because we're in a recession. It's a mild one, but it's the longest one since the end of World War II. There's a tendency then in both political parties to turn inward and say we've got to devote our attention to our problems at home and let the rest of the world take care of itself. I think we have to realize, however, that foreign and domestic policy are like Siamese twins. Neither can survive without the other. The American people will not support a strong foreign policy unless you have a strong domestic policy. And by the same token, the United States cannot be at peace in a world of wars. We can't have a strong American economy in a sick world economy. So we have to therefore have a foreign policy which will move toward a peaceful world and a productive world. For example, take the area of trade. Trade means jobs. For us to go isolationist and protectionist means that we will save the jobs of some and lose the jobs of many times, many more. So under the circumstances then, I am for dealing with our domestic problems. But I realize that you cannot deal with our domestic problems effectively unless you also have an effective way to deal with your foreign problems. The United States must continue to play a role in Asia, in Europe, and of course in what I now call the Second World.
Mr. President, you have been out of office for 18 years, but you have been very influential in policy in the United States. Your recent conference in Washington made the news throughout the world. We watched at home in Korea, and your private memo circulation in Washington, D.C. initiated greater debate on Russian fate. And in your recent reporting about calling Mr. Pat Buchanan to withdraw from presidential race, all this shows how influential you are in the United States. Mr. President, what do you think the role of former presidents in democratic world, democratic society, such as country like Korea, where the democracy is still young?
A former president, and there are now, I guess, 4 of us, a former president will have a role to the extent that he wants to play it. I concentrate only on foreign policy. And people will listen only when you have something to say. When you don't have something to say, they do not listen. There can be no formal role. The parliamentary system is a little better that way. For example, when Churchill was defeated back in 1945, he's still a member of Parliament. He still had a forum. A former president has no forum unless he goes to speak to the Breakfast Club here or the merchants and manufacturers there or some of these other many who do invite them to speak. It's very hard to delineate the role, but I would say that if a former president has something to say, he will be listened to. He has been president, he has a reputation, but the main point is he's got to have something substantive to say. He just can't get up there and make do with the fact that he has this great office and has had it. The reputation isn't enough.
Mr. President, you have known so many leaders in your time. In fact, you wrote a book called Leaders. Of all of those leaders of the pre-Cold War era, of the Cold War era, and the post-Cold War era, who stands out as your own personal hero? Is there one?
Well, everyone's personal hero, certainly in the West, it has to be Winston Churchill. I didn't know him when he was at his best, but Churchill at half speed was better than almost any other leader at full speed. Among others who impressed me enormously, and I will leave out U.S. leaders, that's another factor. De Gaulle was a very impressive leader. He's one you don't forget. And then in Asia, I remember many leaders there. In Japan, Yoshida, who is really the one who made possible the modern Japan. I think in China, for example, of Zhou Enlai, who was a far-sighted leader. I didn't agree with him on a lot of things, but he was a far-sighted leader. I can't say that there's one I would put above the others, except that Churchill, if you're going to pick a man of the century, he has to come in first.
Mr. President, you certainly have had something to say to us this evening, and on behalf of millions of SBS viewers, on behalf of the Seoul Broadcasting System itself, I'd like to thank you for providing us with this dynamic and insightful 30 minutes interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indeed, it was very gracious of you to spend this evening with us.
Well, thank you, and I wish you well, you in your new program, and I want to extend my best wishes and Mrs. Nixon's best wishes to our many friends in Korea. Many of them we have not met, but we have very fond memories of all of them.